Hi, everyone. Today we have a new guest. It's General Stilwell, and we would like to welcome you to our show. Good morning, good afternoon.
Morning. Hey.
Yes, first thing I would like to ask you about the recent events, what happened last week and last weekend, um, the, the interactions between the um, Chinese Air Force and then also the Australian and Canadian. Could you maybe talk a little bit about this? Because as far as it looks, the Chinese are blaming, of course, the West, and the spokesperson of the Ministry of National Defense says they were correct. And, the West or the Canadians are using North Korea as an excuse to harass them. So what's your take on that?
Well, if you look over my right shoulder, you can see two fighters that I used to fly for most of my professional career. So I'm pretty comfortable talking about this. And the timing of these two events is fortuitous because it can bring to mind, I think, the biggest event of this regard was April 1st, 2001, when a Chinese fighter pilot named Wang Wei lost control of his jet, crashed into an American P-3 operating legally in international airspace. The airplane
Yes.
was nowhere near Chinese airspace. So he basically tried to murder, a whole crew of P-3 pilots through his irresponsible actions. And that's not overstating it at all. In my experience in the fighter world, it's a very unique weapons system. Think about it. If you're on the bridge of a Navy ship, which is out there in the South China Sea or the East China Sea doing its job, you're a PLA captain or you're a U.S. Navy captain, you've got the entire bridge watching you, right? Your XO is up
Yes.
there, you've got the navigation officer, and you've got a whole crew of enlisted people who are monitoring what you're doing. And so unprofessional behavior will quickly get reported up to the highest echelons, and you'll be removed as the operator of that war machine. Fighters are a different item altogether. You've got one person in one jet. We used to say you are the mayor of Cockpit City. You are in charge, and there's this sense among young fighter pilots in the U.S. and in China too. There's this sense that I can do whatever I want because there's no one watching me. I'm unsupervised, and this is why you see this behavior. Army officers, Army enlisted, pretty much stay on sovereign territory. It's the Air Force and the Navy that actually extend away from sovereign airspace or water space into international territory and are expected to comport themselves, behave in a certain way. It says a lot about the Chinese military that we continue to have these incidents with Chinese pilots who are not disciplined enough to maintain a safe separation from the target that they're intercepting. Safe separation is defined as 500 feet, unless you absolutely have to get closer for some reason. These guys are getting closer for one reason, and that's to annoy, harass, scare, message Australian, Canadian, American aircraft operating professionally and safely in international airspace. They have every right to be there, and the Chinese aircraft have no right to do this to them. I hope this recording and others get this message out very clearly. PLA Air Force, PLA Navy, Air Force are not ready for prime time.
And where does it come from? I mean, they're supervisors. They must know it, or maybe even, encourage. What's the idea behind it?
People who are familiar with Western militaries understand that we rotate forces every 2 to 3 years, right? I moved 26 times in my career. We move constantly, and we do that to prevent bad habits from embedding themselves in particular bases, units, and all that stuff. In 2001, we knew Ling Shui, the base where Wang Wei took off from in Hainan Island. We knew Ling Shui was not a very professional organization. And we'd seen this behavior out of other pilots out of Ling Shui. And we called them cowboys. They're doing things like holding their email addresses up on the cockpit, flying with their left hand, having a hard time keeping control of the airplane. And this guy thinks he's being funny. The people in the P-3 are scared to death he's going to crash into him, which he eventually did. My point is that the quality of different units and different bases is not consistent because they don't have that constant rotation. And so you end up with these bases. I'm sure you'll find that in these last two unprofessional events where the leadership allows this sort of thing. They either don't have the ability or maybe they don't have the will to make sure that their young pilots operate in a professional manner. And so they all watched Top Gun. They all
Yes.
watched another Chinese movie called Jianshi Chuji, right? J-10 Attack. It's
Yes.
the Chinese version of Top Gun. If you haven't seen it, you should watch it. It's illustrative, and it shows how they took the wrong lessons from Top Gun. So the idea of flying inverted over the top of the thing you intercepted, of doing crazy things, very much resonates in the world of the Chinese fighter pilot. This is why you continue to see these things. It's a quality control issue. It's an issue of professionalism. It's the fact that they don't rotate very often. So you'll have centers of excellence. Swayze, I understand, is actually pretty good, but there are bases that are out of control. And last things, in our system, we say bad news never gets better with age. When something bad happens, you report it up the chain immediately and you come clean. Because you won't get killed if you tell the truth. If you
Yes.
lie about it, we will kill you. Figuratively, we don't take that
Yes.
to kill you, but you're done. Your career is over if you lie about it.
Yes.
In their system, that doesn't seem to be the case. In 2001, the Chinese military leaders said with a straight face that the P-3 maneuvered violently and crashed into our best fighter. It's impossible. That is absolutely impossible to do. They're assuming that they're on a level road and he swerved into him and he got out of the way. What these guys don't know, because they're all Army, is that in that case, you just go up. Fighters can go up or down, right? So if somebody's going to get in your way, you just pop up and go over them. But their leader, the Air Force leaders, told their senior leaders that were dealing with the U.S. that the Navy P-3, a big lumbering 1950s airliner, somehow maneuvered violently and crashed into their premier indigenous fighter, and they believed that.
Yeah, that is really concerning. So they kind of want to be, even they are so nationalistic, they kind of be more and more American as much as it gets, because they want to catch up with the American Top Gun level, or how is it? They try to be as American as it gets, right? So my question is, who's actually training them? Do they have like a process, or do they have instructors that are really good? Or is it really like all screwed up? Their instructors are bad, the supervision is bad, the chain of command is bad. Whereas I heard is like since Xi Jinping, he got the PLA under his grip. So is it all wrong, or what's going on with the PLA?
A couple of things. You have two Air Forces. You have the PLA Air Force, People's Liberation Army Air Force. Then you have the People's Liberation Army Navy Air Force, the most joint unit in the world. Army, Navy, Air Force. And so these are the guys who are flying J-16s off carriers, and they also obviously flying land-based fighters as well. So I think there's an issue there with consistency across services. In my experience, I spent a lot of time flying against and with U.S. Navy pilots, fighter pilots as well, whether we were deployed to Iraq or we're just training at Red Flag or whatever. So there's a consistency there, which I don't see in the PLA. The other thing is the PLA Air Force brags about a program they called the Golden Helmet Program. It's their version of Top Gun, where they do bring their best and brightest tacticians, and they help them get better at their craft. I don't see that trickling down in the units, though, but this is not my particular area. I can't speak directly to the individual skills of individual pilots. I observed a lot in Beijing when I was there as a defense attaché, and we had a chance to talk to them. But as far as their individual tactics and stuff, I haven't really gotten to see that. But looking at it from the outside, what you do see is sort of a very structured training regimen. In the U.S. Air Force, we actually encourage our young flight leaders to experiment and to try different things, so long as they're within, they're not stupid. And that this is where you get innovation. This is how you adapt new weapon systems to new targets and new things. And I'm very proud of the things that we accomplished doing that. We also learned from our allies and partners. I had a Dutch exchange officer in my unit when I was at Shaw Air Force Base, South Carolina, and he brought a whole new perspective that benefited how we did things. It kind of broadened I don't see that in the PRC system. They do exercise with the Russians, and that they learn from that. I'm not sure they learn the right things from that, but it's still a very Soviet Russian system with political commissars and all the rest. So they're just two very different systems, apples and oranges.
So I will get back to that question, like, is there no, does the supervision not work? Like, if this thing gets public, so there are no consequences. It's just they try to spin it in their favor. Like you said, back then, 2001, the establishment accused the Americans of causing it. Now we have a spokesman of the ministry. So in 2 decades, no improvement, nothing happened. They still do it the old way.
I think there has been some because we haven't had these episodes for quite a while. When I was in the Pentagon in 13 to 15, we had one or two. And I remember we actually brought video and photos at one time, and we sat down with, again, the senior leadership when they were visiting, and we just slid the photos across the table and
Okay.
asked them, does that look like a safe distance to you? And you could see them kind of like swallow hard and go, oh, this is not what we were told. To see one of their fighters that close to the wing of an American reconnaissance aircraft. So they were surprised to hear, our version of it, and we brought evidence that. Now they went back and spun it, and they says, "Oh, you could have used a telephoto lens." I mean, yeah, but the message to the senior leadership was clean, that they weren't getting the straight story from their people.
Okay. Okay.
The political commissar, the person who should be reporting on this sort of unprofessional behavior, doesn't fly. This guy is basically a ground officer who, if you see the movie J-10 Attack, it's pretty interesting to see how that works, right? The leadership at top, the number two and the number one, the executive officer and the commander, are actually in this sort of tug of war to see which way the unit's going to go as far as their tactics and stuff. And the tiebreaker is the political commissar. It doesn't work that way in our system. I'll listen to my number two, my deputy, on what he thinks. But once the door opens again and we've come to a decision, that's the direction we're going. I don't need a third party to weigh in. I'm saying there's a lot of structural issues in this system that lend itself to this sort of problem. And the only real solution is embarrassment, is exactly what you're doing here, is to get it out in the open and demonstrate not just to the Chinese side, but to the world that the PLA needs to clean its act up.
So you're saying it's actually not that bad because we had 2 decades kind of uneventful time, and now it just comes back maybe like an accident or somebody's overzealous.
Exactly. We have a issue. What we call it flight discipline. It's one of the three main areas we judge a young fighter pilot. And if this guy doesn't demonstrate simple flight discipline, being able to be in the right place at the right time, resisting the urge to show off like that, do air shows, we don't keep them around because they tend to kill themselves and other people in the process. Again, I don't see that system necessarily reflecting that approach. Will we see it again? No. Now that it's embarrassed the government, the fact that they're reacting the way they are and saying, "Oh, you guys are wrong." Clearly, they understand, in private, that they screwed this up. And it's not just the Americans this time; it's the Canadians and the Australians are going after. This is a different. But who we haven't heard from is the Japanese, because these intercepts have been happening for a long time near the Senkakus, and whether they're more professional with Japan, I don't know. But talking to my Japanese friends, they have other issues similar to this. So yeah, if you can get a hold of some folks on the Japanese side, that would be a good conversation to have.
Okay, so one more question with regard to this topic is how do you see, is there an escalation with regards to the Taiwan Strait possible? Like, could someone again overdo it, or maybe there would be like a order from above to escalate the situation and then maybe provoke Taiwan, check how they react. So that kind of stuff, would it be possible in a strait?
I think so. This is what an approach that is seen as low risk, is you get maybe inch closer and closer, or you flood the zone with a number of airplanes or something like that. So I don't think we've seen the last of that. As you know, we've seen growing numbers approaching the center line.
Yes.
You heard recent statements that says the center line isn't really an official thing. It's just a quiet agreement or whatever. And so I don't doubt that. But again, we train the Taiwan pilots. We train with the Taiwan pilots in Arizona. And I think they're great pilots. The exchange is very valuable, and they understand. But here's something that, again, I see in the Taiwan Strait that you don't see elsewhere. And you see it with Japan a little bit too. The whole point of these intercepts is to get to an aircraft that's unidentified in time to identify what type of aircraft, identify what its intentions are, and then have time to destroy it before it gets to sovereign airspace. Because it could be a bomber. These tactics all developed during the Cold War, when Soviet bombers would come over the pole and they would approach Canadian airspace and U.S. airspace. So we would launch fighters well before they got to our official, our territory, to go intercept, get a good look at them. You look at the airplane and see what's on it. Is it carrying external weapons? Is it a bomber or a reconnaissance aircraft, et cetera? And then once you characterize the aircraft, what it's there to do, then you make a decision with the help of the command and control authorities on the ground as to how to do, what to do about it. Shadow it, just stay close to it, all the way to shooting it down if it's obviously on a hostile trajectory. Point there is there's two different types of aircraft. There's the interceptor being launched from China, and then there's the intercepted aircraft, which is generally a reconnaissance aircraft coming from outside of Chinese airspace. What you don't do is put two fighters in the same chunk of sky, right? You don't put two aircraft that both have forward-firing ordnance pointing at each other, because it takes one small mistake, and now you got, catastrophic results, probable death, and then now you're in a completely different escalatory cycle. And so when the Chinese aircraft are approaching Taiwan, they're typically reconnaissance aircraft. But when you start putting a fighter running at the Taiwan airspace or Japan airspace at high speed, you set yourself up for really unfortunate outcomes if anybody panics. It takes one switch action, just one button, and you just launched a missile that you probably can't recover. So I think everybody should take a big step back, take a deep breath, understand what the potential bad outcomes here are, and do some risk assessment and say, is it worth it here to send this message? And frankly, it's not.
Yeah, but it seems like the Chinese don't think this way. This alpha attitude, they are just pushing the limits all the time, both in diplomacy and also here, like humiliating American diplomats or even the president, with the G20 thing. He had to leave the Air Force One through the back or side exit, with a lot of such things. So it seems like both in diplomacy and militarily, they just keep doing the same thing, testing the West. And the worrying thing is that there is actually no firm reply. It just talks, it's a concern, it's a strategic surprise, like Kurt Campbell said it with regards to the Salomon Islands. So it's always a surprise, concern, and then a remark, but nothing really happens. So why wouldn't they push back?
Some of these actions, though, we can't put in the bad behavior category. Some of these actions are something we would do if we were in the same position. Solomon Islands. Now, the way they get these countries to sign up for these things is unfortunate. There was a report from the Australian Broadcast Corporation in 2019, I think, that when Solomon Islands flipped recognition from Taiwan to Beijing, this report said that Sogavare put $1 million in his own bank account to do that. Again, I'm quoting them. I'm not saying that's true or false.
Yes.
But that pattern is pretty familiar, what we've seen how the PRC does things elsewhere in the world. It's elite capture. You give money to those who make decisions. You trust that they're going to sell out the interests of their people for their own personal interest. The one MDB scandal in Malaysia is a good example of this, and it got Najib voted out of office. Yes. So democracies have some say-so when leaders choose to do these things. But again, I'm not going to demonize them. This is their strategy for, we have to do a better job of immunizing our allies, partners, and friends from these approaches. And the way you do that is you simply, again, as John Garneau says, is you use transparency, sunlight, and you expose the things that they would rather not be exposed. The Sogavare example is one. There's been separate reports. Most recently this year, there was a similar report with a similar number reported. So the diplomatic behavior is not unexpected. It's unfortunate. International rules and norms say we shouldn't do these things, right? You shouldn't be tipping over governments, using bribes and corruption, mostly because it's going to bounce back. Look at Pakistan. Look at the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And look at the corruption that got them into that deal. And look how much regret and buyer's remorse the Pakistanis are having to deal with now. $60 billion of debt they can't possibly service because none of the infrastructure that was going in there to actually produce revenue for new industry, moving things to ports and all that stuff, none of that has come to pass. The same story happens in Africa. And yet they are on the hook for the debt. And so it is backfiring. These stories are coming out more and more. And, I think the PRC could compete just as well on a level playing field. But I think they're in a rush and they're trying to get as much as they can, as quick as they can. And like I said, it's not working.
Okay, but you were in the government, and so how is there no idea to push back, like even militarily? I mean, this is going to continue, right? They are just going to try the West again and again. So, what could be like? Let's say you could decide about a possible reaction, reciprocal reaction. What would you do?
Well, you use the word reciprocal, and weirdly, that was like a new word when I got to State Department. When you say that, the automatic response that comes out of diplomatic training, and it's a good response, is that that's transactional. That's the most base form of international diplomacy. Is if you kick me, I punch you, right? You hope that with as we move up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and as we move up the food chain, that we'll do things because it benefits both, and we have true win-win outcomes. But if you're working with a partner that doesn't think in those terms, if they only think in transactional terms, guess what? Your only approach is reciprocal treatment.
Yes.
And so if they've got 150 journalists in the U.S. and we've got 30, and they keep denying visas to them, we're going to have to take some pretty solid steps, which is why we denied visas, or we actually removed 60 of their journalists. These journalists never had a byline. They'd never actually done any reporting. They weren't journalists. They were doing other things. So, but really the only way we're going to get to a real reciprocal outcome on that was to take all down to zero, have them bring all of ours down to zero, and then start, you give me one, I give you one, and just start working our way back up that way. Reset the relationship. And that's where we're going to have to go on this. Is we're going to have to do the most basic sort of transactional interaction to get, because we're not getting what we need. They're so used to promising everything and then not delivering, just folding their arms and sort of laughing at us. And so our approach in the last administration was to, have to lower ourselves. We didn't want to that more basic reciprocal approach. We use that in media and in diplomats. We began to treat their diplomats the same way they treat us. We're basically locked down in Beijing. We can't go talk to really anybody.
Yes.
Yet they had the free run of the country. And so we started clamping down on that.